And the first deal I did was with John and his mother and Clarence Lerner, who used to own Lerner stores. We bought some land at probably, I think, around 25 or 30 acres at Fair Oaks and Tasman in Sunnyvale.
We bought the Betancourt Dairy over there, and it's now all R&D buildings. And we've torn some of the R&D buildings down since then and built apartments.
I only had $5,000, so I put $5,000 in the deal. That was my total investment in the deal. One of the properties that I ended up with, I think when we settled all that out, I ended up with 2 or 3 of those properties. But one of them alone, I sold for $900,000. So my $5,000 investment turned out to be pretty good. In 1969, we built our first building. That was the corner of Arquez and Lawrence Expressway.
It was an excess piece that the county had left over when they put the kind of clover leaf in that corner.
John and I must have designed 35 different plans to fit on a 1-acre lot. If there was a way you could put a building on a 1-acre lot, we drew it up. So we finally agreed upon something.
And then we went to the Carl Hovick Company and built a 30,000-foot tilt-up for, I think, $450 a square foot.
This certainly was not the most beautiful building we ever built. Most of the tenants you would get back in those days were startups, especially for a little building. So finally this company came along and they said, hey, we're really interested in your building, but we got to raise, the typical amount a venture startup would do then was $250,000. They said, we got to raise $250,000, and if we can, we'll lease your building. So I thought about that a couple of days, and I said to John, John, do you realize if we give those guys $250,000, we can get and they sign a lease with us, we can get a $3 million loan. And so that was how we first got in the venture capital business. And that company made an XYZ system, you know, for measuring laser beams and stuff like that. And right after they got in this building, the economy went to hell. And basically, so the guy that ran the company came to me and he said, we've decided we're going to try and make lettuce slicers to keep us going during the economy. So I told everybody that my first venture investment was the latest laser lettuce slicer.
They went broke, and then we brought another fellow in. I remember his name. He was an Indian PhD, taught at Stanford, Raul Channapragada, and he had this gadget that I think was one of the first disk drive type gadgets ever invented. And so he took over the building, and after 3 or 4 months he stopped paying the rent, so we had to make a little visit. And it turned out he just ran out of money. And Carl, you know, being interested in technology, was very interested and intrigued with the guy's product, and said, you know, this thing could really take off if you just had somebody on the financial side that could kind of figure out where you were. You know, that's what you need help on. I mean, obviously you're a great scientist, but you're not a businessman. So Dr. Channapragada said, okay, Carl, if you're so smart, why don't you come on down here and help me? And, you know, we'll give you a piece of the company. He started by trying to straighten out their inventories. It's kind of a funny story, but anyway, they have all these bins of all these parts, and nobody knew how much they had. So Carl would go down and he started counting these parts every night by the thousands, you know. And after a couple of days, one of the engineers comes by and says, Carl, why are you doing this? He said, well, I got to figure out how many parts you got. He said, well, you know, they're only worth 5 cents each. What we do is we weigh them. And he said, oh, you weigh them? You don't count them by hand?
And it was soon after that that we met Amdahl. And Amdahl at that time had 5 people.
And we were fortunate enough to pick them up in 4,000 feet. Then we built them 30, and then another 30, and another 30. So we had them up to about 100,000 total.
And then they signed up to do this 200,000 square foot campus. And that was really the thing that made everybody aware that we were in the business.
Just before they are ready to move in, we get the phone call from Amdahl. It says, unfortunately, we don't have enough money and we can't move in the campus. And Shortly thereafter, I had a heart attack. I'm not sure if it was related to this or not, but I don't think it helped.
It was probably the dumbest deal we ever made, because the rents on that Amdahl space are still only 29 to 35 cents or 40 cents. Probably in about 1970, we were having our buildings built for various contractors. The construction foreman for the guy we were working with was a guy by the name of Thelmer Algard. Thelmer, soon after that, joined us.
And Thelmer Algard, a superb character and one of Carl's key guys, he executed that building from a shovel in the ground to me in it building wafers in 7.5 months.
He's been my superintendent for the last 40 years. And he's ran every job that we had. I've never had a job that was late in completion. I've never had a job that overran the cost. And I've never had one that we didn't finish on time, on budget. And his license plate on his car is no extras.
No, I think Carl will tell you that we made a very, very good partner.
We were 50-50 partners on the buildings, except occasionally his mother would be involved in one. And
we got in a lot of places. You know, Berg sounds Jewish, Sobrato sounds Sobrato Italian, so between the two of us we get in most stores. And those we couldn't, my mother got us in for some unknown reason, how she was able to do it. But she was able to get us appointments.
It was unbelievable. So she felt that she should have an interest in some of the buildings. And so that was fine with us. And so in 1978, though, I had more and more gone off into the venture capital business.
And so it appeared that the best thing for us to do would be to divide our properties. So I wanted to concentrate on real estate. Carl wanted to basically do both.
I did an A and B list, and I figured, and then John got to pick whichever side he wanted. So on one side, I put all the buildings that I had worked on. On the other side, I put all the buildings that John had worked on. And I did everything I could to make it as fair as possible. Then I added $1 million worth of buildings to John's side to make sure he picked the right side.
I think I surprised Carl because he figured I'd choose the one building which was the nicest building that we built, which was a 4-story that Apple's in now, that I built for 4-phase.
John picks the other side. So I say to him afterwards, I said, John, why did you do that? He said, I figured out you gave me an extra $1 million, but I couldn't figure out why, so I picked the other side. And I think there was, other than that, there was probably another motivation. On the other side was the place where the Apple campus is now, and John really wanted to build his headquarters right there on the corner of De Anza and Mariani. So I think that had an influence on it, but I always say that by John taking that pick, I made an extra $1 million. So when John and I split up, we changed the name of the company to Berg and Berg, and my brother was running the construction, which he did until 1990. And he took care of everything in the field, and I took care of all the financial stuff, all the leasing, and all of the office-related stuff. I formed a venture capital company, and I got 16 guys from Silicon Valley. And I told them the only way they could invest was if they participated in the decision-making, and we weren't going to invest in any company that one of those guys didn't know everything about. Well, we had the greatest track record anyone has ever seen, or probably ever will see. We had 38 investments and had 1 failure. And in that group was Integrated Devices Technology, was one of the main companies, and the other one was Sun Microsystems. And I actually did absolutely nothing to get Sun, and it was one of my all-time great winners. And the reason was Scott McNeely was working in a company called Onyx that I was the CEO of because the techies didn't want to be CEO. And Scott was the manufacturing manager. When they decided to start Sun, he offered us the opportunity to be the first investor. So we bought 25% of Sun for $1 million. And at the same time, IDT had started. IDT was started by 5 guys from HP, and they came to me looking for a building. What I would do in those days when anybody came to me looking for a building, if it was a startup, I'd say, well, how much money do you need to raise and what are you going to do with it, and so on. So these guys told me they needed to raise $5 million. Well, that was way out of my league. So I said, well, why do you need so much money? And they said, well, we got to build a fab. And we've got this new technology called CMOS. And I came back to them and I said, look, what if I could get you a fab that you could use and let you prove your technology works? And we don't have to build the fab, then you could get by on $1 million or less. So they said, fine, if you can do this. So I said, well, there's a company that we have in one of our fab buildings by the name of Nitron. And I said, Nitron hasn't done very well. And so it's what I suggest we do. We go to Nitron and we tell them we'd like to use their fab to develop our first chip. And I said, since they haven't been too successful, we'll give them a right to that first chip if it works. Or if it doesn't work, they get a right to it anyway, but they get a right to that first chip for letting us use their fab, and we prove whether the technology works or not. And if it does work, the likelihood of them being able to do anything with it is almost zero, so we lose nothing by doing this. And so that's how we started IDT.
I had joined IDT in 1980, probably around about 83. We wanted to buy some land down in Salinas and build a building, and so I needed some advice from Carl. We had a deal. He was our board member. He was going to buy the land and build to suit, and then maybe we could buy the land from him and buy the building at another time when we had the money to afford it. So I'd found the land. It was down there by the airport on Moffett Boulevard or Moffett Street or something in Salinas, and Carl was going to drive down and take a look at it. We're going to appraise that land together. So we drove about 80 miles down, shooting the breeze, and I pulled onto the street there where the land was. We pulled up, and I'm thinking, this guy's the guru. I'm going to find out how a guy appraises land here. This is, go to engineering school all you want, but knowing how to really figure out what land's worth is really important. So Carl and I got out, and we walked around a little bit and walked about 100 feet out in the field there, and Carl just hauled his fly down and vacated his kidney, and I thought, zipped it up and turned around, looked at me and said, looks good to me, let's get the hell out of here.
Never forget, I went to Jim Parrish and I asked him, I said, hey, we want to get into this development. How would you like to do it with us? You do the leasing, we'll do all the other stuff, and see if you can find us a good spot. And Jim Parrish said, okay, I'll go out and do that, I'm interested. So he went out, and about 2 weeks later he comes back, I'll never forget it, with a package. He says, here's the option on the land, here's the location, here's the option on the land, here's the deal that I think we ought to do, and by the way, we have a financier, we're going to partner with Carl and Clyde Berg, and they'll provide all the money. And that was the deal when we had nothing. So we got started with this project that way. The first tenant that we had in the one building was a very major bank. So we were fine. We went down and we sat down with the executive vice president of the bank. He had been negotiating this deal with us, signed the lease, and we went back with the lease. And about 2 weeks later, we get a call from the bank. It's the chairman of the bank, the CEO, the president, and one of their board members. And we went down to the bank. And the bank says, the fellow who signed your lease passed away a few days after he signed the lease, and proceeded to tell us that he didn't have the authority to sign the lease and that they were going to rescind the lease. So we were brand new people. We were just little guys in this world, and we just couldn't believe we were listening to this. So we came back over and sat down with Carl and went through it with him. Now Carl could have been difficult. He could have second guessed us. He could have done a million different things. But after listening to all the facts, this is what he said. He said, go back down to that board, get those fellows together, go back down there right away. And this is what I want you to tell them. You tell them Carl Berg's a partner in this deal. Carl Berg has reviewed all the facts, and if they want to fight, they'll wish he hadn't picked one with us. Now here's a couple of guys, I mean, we're sweating like crazy, and he said, that's exactly what he said. So we went down there, we sat down, and we delivered this message. We had all of them there, and we delivered this message. And then we got up and left. And about a week later, they called us back. And so we went back down there, and they said, well, we thought about this, and we could use the building, but we need some more tenant improvement allowances. So allowance on this thing. So the way that ended up, we walked out of that meeting with, instead of a 5-year lease and a 15-year tenant improvement allowance, we got a 15-year lease and a $25 tenant improvement allowance, and that bank stayed there for 15 years, and they didn't rescind their lease. But if we hadn't had Carl, and if he hadn't been there to give us that bit of strength and support right there when we needed it, it could have been a different picture.
So I picked up my things and I went over to Carl Berg's office and sat down with him and began to tell him my story about my interest in this telephone company and my interest in the industry space. And Carl, I guess, seemed to like me, because 4 hours later, he offered me a job. And he changed my life when he and I decided to take on this company and go forward. Teledex grew to be the #1 supplier in the world of telephones in hotel rooms. We sold over 14 million telephones, thanks to Carl, and thanks to his involvement in allowing me to get going. But Carl was an interesting landlord.
I decided, well, I've got a lot of vacant buildings, so why don't I move Teledex into one that I'm not having any luck leasing. So I picked what I considered the last building on earth we would lease. And about a month and a half after I moved Teledex in there, we rented the building. So I convinced Teledex to move, and we took them to another building that I thought I couldn't lease.
He told me always that there'll always be a home somewhere.
A couple of months later, we leased that building. So I thought, this is really working for me. So I offered to pay Teledex $50,000 for moving this time.
We got the back corner of the back building in the rear. And there was obviously probably an emergency exit with a couple steps to go in, and that became our front door. So we had a front door, which was the back door of the building, and we moved into that space. We put our pallet racks up. We were growing a little bit as we go.
I moved him to another building. Same thing happened within 6 months. I don't know how long it was, but less than 6 months. So I paid him $100,000 for moving. So this was going on, and Teledex was making more money getting the moving fees from me than they were from the business early on.
That wasn't our last home. We moved again. A few years later, we ended up in South San Jose in a building that was a former home of IBM, some IBM buildings in South San Jose. And I expect that the building was probably not occupied recently, because I later found out that that was the last location of IBM punch card technology. So I suspect that building might have been vacant since the late 70s sometime. In any event, we built our fortune there. We occupied a part of the building when we got started, and as our business grew, the building, we expanded until we took the whole building.